There have been so many Robin Hood adaptations over the past 100-some-odd years, ever since they started making movies. Like, so many. Without even doing any Googling, I know that there's The Adventures of Robin Hood from 1938, starring Olivia de Havilland and Errol Flynn, the Disney animated Robin Hood from 1973, Robin and Marian from 1976, Robin Hood Prince of Thieves from 1991, Robin Hood Men in Tights from 1993, the 2010 Robin Hood directed by Ridley Scott, and that weird ahistorical quasi-fantasy Robin Hood that nobody saw back in 2018. The character also makes notable appearances in everything from Shrek to the 2001 made-for-TV movie Princess of Thieves, starring a pre-superstardom Keira Knightley as Robin's daughter Gwyn. At this point, the story of Robin Hood has been adapted into so many different kinds of films, from action to comedy to furry-adjacent musical, that your personal favorite probably says a lot more about you than it does the actual film.
Oh, he's so handsome, just like his reward posters.
Do you like romantic swashbucklers? Dour ruminations on squandered legacy?
If there were a way to turn time back just 5 minutes, I'd give my soul to do it.
Kevin Costner's one and only facial expression. Look, I'm sorry, but this is not the best Robin Hood film ever made. It's not even the best Robin Hood film of 1991. All jokes aside, I'm not here to question anyone's tastes. You're free to like whichever Robin Hoods you like, but that freedom extends to me too. See, there are some who say that Ridley Scott's Robin Hood from 2010 doesn't belong on anyone's list, and that it's actually pretty terrible. Anthony Lane of The New Yorker called it pathologically glum, that Russell Crowe cuts a lonesome figure even when leading a cavalry charge on a white steed. Dour and done. Joe Newmeyer of the New York Daily News said that it had one muddy boot in history and the other in fantasy, with middling results that are far from a bullseye. Heyo! Roger Ebert even cited the film in his review as evidence that, little by little, title by title, innocence and joy is being drained out of the movies. Jesus. And it'd be one thing if nobody agreed that this was their favorite Robin Hood. If that's the case, fine. You're free to like whatever you like. But what I find so surprising, strange, and ever so slightly annoying is that so many people think that this is the very, very worst. What, are you allergic to Ridley Scott's eclectic brand of medieval historicity? Brian Helgeland's tightrope balancing of political intrigue and sky-high emotional stakes? A cute little will they won't they romance from two leads who are both over 40? Pre-superstardom Oscar Isaac chewing the scenery like so much bubblegum?
You lie!
Mark Streitenfeld's kick-ass score? Or do you just think the one and only anti-monarchist Robin Hood doesn't rate?
The laws of this land enslave people to its king. A king who demands loyalty but offers nothing in return.
Every retelling of a story as old as Robin Hood needs some new angle. Maybe it's animated. Maybe Robin's nearing the end of his life. Maybe he's French.
'Cause I'm about to start.
This version was sold to the public as a dark and gritty retelling of Robin Hood's origin, a pitch that not only failed to connect with audiences, but is also something of a misguided underselling of its true appeal, if you ask me. This adaptation began life as a spec script called Nottingham, which retold the Robin Hood legend from the perspective of a much more sympathetic Sheriff of Nottingham, pitted against a far less virtuous Robin of Locksley.
Your next move will be your last.
That's not necessarily the pitch that I would have gone with. I mean, the last thing we need right now is more sympathetic depictions of cops, but at least it was a new idea. But soon after Ridley Scott was hired to direct in April of 2007, the script started to get rewritten, and production was delayed several times due to Scott's dissatisfaction with the script. One draft featured what was described as a CSI-style forensic investigator sheriff. Another version combined Robin and the sheriff into one person, a man torn between his desire to serve the king and to protect the people of Nottingham. At some point in one of these drafts, screenwriter Brian Helgeland came up with the idea of Robin stealing the identity of the sheriff, which, as far as I can tell, eventually became what we see in the finished film. A common archer for hire by the name of Robin Longstride witnesses the death of Sir Robert Locksley, aide to the recently deceased King Richard, and promptly assumes his identity as a means of catching a ride back to England.
We were told to expect 12 riders and the king.
Our beloved king is dead.
He only intends to assume Locksley's identity for a day, just long enough to cross the English Channel. But him and his mates subsequently oversleep on the ride back, and then he has to personally deliver the news of King Richard's death to the king's brother John.
Did you say you were from Nottingham? Yes.
Robin then rides to Nottingham, not to keep impersonating Locksley, but merely to return the family sword to Locksley's father Walter and Locksley's widow Marion.
My grief has been waiting for this day.
But Walter takes an instant shine to Rob, and suggests he continue to impersonate his son as a means of protecting the family lands from seizure by the throne.
I want you to stay in Nottingham and, for the time being, become my returned son, and therefore Marion's spouse.
Robin agrees,
Yes.
much to Marion's chagrin and Walter's delight.
I woke this morning with a tumescent glow. 84. A miracle, huh?
I've always wondered at the private conversations of men.
From here, Robin sets out to rehabilitate his newfound home, which has been raided and taxed to the brink of oblivion by local runaways, an indifferent church, and the conniving sheriff. This stretch of the film is more about created family and community than it is about fighting with the king, not to mention giving Marion a reason to appreciate his company. Rob manages to replant stolen grain, teach the runaways how to care for themselves, and bring back a sense of pride and prosperity that hadn't been seen in Nottingham since before the Crusades.
Music, laughter, the crackle of a bonfire, and the roasting pig. Life has returned.
But King John wants his money, and eventually orders the collection of even harsher taxes, which pushes the country to the brink of civil war. But then an expeditionary force of Norman invaders forces the king to finally play nice with his subjects. Robin and his fellow Englishmen demand a charter of rights.
If your majesty were to offer justice, justice in the form of a charter of liberties, and that king would be great. Not only would he receive the loyalty of his people, but their love as well.
To which King John dutifully agrees.
I give my word that such a charter will be written.
But is he actually going to sign it once the threat of French invasion is finally gone? In attempting to distinguish this adaptation from all the others, the marketing department subsequently pitched this as Robin Hood's dark and gritty origin story, which I, for one, am not surprised failed to resonate with audiences and critics. Isn't every Robin Hood film a retelling of his origins to some degree or another? The only film on our list that doesn't cover Robin Hood's origins, the only one that starts with him already living life as an outlaw, is the Disney animated version. Every other film starts off with him as a law-abiding citizen, and then dutifully depicts his subsequent fall from grace.
Leave him.
Who do you think you are? This man is a poacher.
On my land.
Granted, this is the only adaptation that waits until the very last scene to declare him an outlaw.
I declare him from this day forth to be an outlaw!
Mild spoiler alert, I guess. But I think for most viewers, the formal declaration is just that, a formality. He's still battling various agents of the state from the jump, butting heads with everyone from the sheriff of Nottingham to the local church leadership to the warmongering Godfrey, who's busy stoking the fires of both a civil war and a foreign invasion simultaneously. Personally, I think the only reason they called this an origin story is because it doesn't include any of the more famous Robin Hood set pieces, like the fight over the toll bridge, the archery contest he wins in disguise, or a showdown with the sheriff in a castle. And I think they just didn't want audiences to be sitting around waiting for them. That plus origin stories were really hot in 2010. I don't think that pitching it as a dark and gritty reboot was a super compelling choice either. For one thing, it's really not that grim and dark. There's warmth and humor, levity and joy injected all throughout.
Hello, Marion. I've come to save you.
It's not like I can show you every line that makes me laugh, but rest assured, anyone who calls this film a joyless bore is just factually incorrect.
Lady Marion Locksley, my wife.
Well played.
And as for the look of the film, I actually really like the look of the film. Contrast has always been way more important to me than saturation, but it does seem weird to me to spend $200 million on a story that's already been adapted to film over a dozen times and then try to sell it on the aesthetics. It just seems like a stretch. And hey, look, The film did manage to earn its budget back at the box office. In fact, it was the 23rd highest grossing historical drama ever made at the time of its release, a genre that includes things like Pirates of the Caribbean, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and the Flintstones. So it's not like this was the worst marketing campaign ever. But I guess the reason it still gets to me so much is that so many people still think it's just a dark and gritty retelling of Robin Hood's origin. So, what's the real selling point? Why do I find it so compelling? Well, let me ask you. Why make Robin Longstride steal the identity of Robert Locksley in the first act? Why the switch? Why not just have noble Lord Robin Locksley return home from the Crusades after the death of King Richard and have the film proceed from there? What's the point of this ruse? Well, I'll tell you. It's the only way we could get the world's first anti-monarchist Robin Hood on the screen. Most adaptations of Robin Hood are fundamentally pro-monarchy. It's just a question of which particular monarch Rob supports. He always opposes King John, but usually only in the name of King Richard.
Traitor to the crown. That crown belongs to King Richard. Long live King Richard! Long live King Richard!
The classic version of the story begins with Prince John stealing the throne, and then Robin and his merry men hold off his goons long enough for King Richard to return home from the Crusades and then put everything back into place. A disappointing deus ex machina, if you ask me.
Thanks to you, I still have the throne.
And what's more, Robin's main motivation usually has something to do with getting his land back, which is usually seized by Prince John in the opening act. So Robin Hood is usually the story of a landed feudal lord, a feudal landlord, if you will, who simply sides with the monarch who stands to restore the most amount of property to him.
Nottingham declared all Locksley lands forfeit.
Lots of adaptations certainly minimize the role of King John. Both Robin and Marian and Robin Hood 1991 reduce him to a mere cameo, and neither Robin Hood Prince of Thieves nor Robin Hood 2018 even feature him. But then it's not like the monarchy doesn't exist in either of these two films. These two films seem less opposed to the systems of power that facilitate the abuse than the mere asses that happen to occupy those seats of power. As Dan Olson neatly summarized in his video about Robin Hood 2018,
the only person who can start a bad rich person is a good rich person.
Even when King John isn't present in the film, the filmmakers basically just farm his duties out to the Sheriff of Nottingham anyway, who then becomes a king by any other name.
Just to remind them they're not the people, they're my subjects. Just to remind them they're not the people.
Now, Robin and Marian notably starts off with Rob refusing to take orders from a blood-frenzied King Richard. Don't get confused now, Sean Connery has played both Robin Hood and King Richard in two different films. But I wouldn't go so far as to call this guy an anti-monarchist.
And he took the children, all the children, and had them chopped apart. When that was done, he had the mothers killed.
Why didn't you come home then?
He was my king.
Anyway, my main point is that while not every adaptation of Robin Hood paints the monarchy as something good or even decent, no previous Robin Hoods ever actively opposed it. Enter Robin Longstride, working-class archer for hire in the army of King Richard. He's not a true believer, though. He barely even qualifies as a loyal subject. He just needs a paycheck. In one of the first scenes, King Richard asks Rob to tell him what God thinks of his crusade, and by extension, what he thinks of his rule.
What is your opinion on my crusade? Will God be pleased with my sacrifice?
And we get this.
No, he won't. The massacre at Akrasaya.
By most historical accounts, King Richard was no more noble or diligent a ruler than his brother John. He probably didn't spend more than 6 months of his adult life in England. We don't even know if he could speak English, and regarded his kingdom more as a source of funding for his armies than as a personal responsibility. So it's refreshing to see a depiction of King Richard where he's not so venerated as in other adaptations. Anyway, Rob is put in the stocks for his honesty, him and a few buddies who are found guilty by association. The only reason Rob finally manages to go home is because King Richard dies while storming a castle, and the army disbands.
The king is dead.
Dead?
Dead.
Right then, Jimmy. Knock the pegs out. We make our own fate from now on.
But by killing King Richard in the opening act, the film sets up an interesting twist on the traditional story. By the time Robin makes it back to England, King John's rule isn't contested. He is the rightful king of England, assuming there's a rightful king at all.
Long life, my son.
This isn't the first adaptation to do this, but the other two adaptations that feature King John as the rightful ruler of England are the two that relegate him to a mere cameo, and don't spend much of any time articulating any specific complaints about him. Whereas this King John is central to the main conflict, and therefore provides Robin with a unique opportunity to air his grievances against the crown.
The laws of this land enslave people to its king. A king who demands loyalty but offers nothing in return.
In this adaptation, and this adaptation alone, Rob wants to replace King John's unquestioned absolute rule with a Charter of Rights for all Englishmen, the People's Magna Carta, basically, which isn't so much a complete dismantling of the monarchy as it is a vital first step in that direction.
So what would you have? Castle for every man.
Every Englishman's home is his castle.
And I mean, do I even need to explain the appeal of a uniquely anti-monarchist Robin Hood? Is anyone still simping for European monarchs these days? Besides the half-dozen celebrity crushes I unfollowed after they posted cringy tributes to Queen Elizabeth after her death, the same celebrity crushes I re-followed a few days later because they're still my celebrity crushes? You'd think if any adaptation of Robin Hood would appeal to specifically American audiences, it would be a uniquely anti-monarchist version who's trying to draft the spiritual predecessor to the Bill of Rights. And yet no dice. Why am I the only one jazzed about this? Well, I think it's because most Americans are only opposed to monarchy in name only. Americans have no problem with the amount of power that kings possess, just so long as their guy possesses all that power. The only difference now is that we elect our national leaders every 4 years instead of having to depose them or wait for them to die. But I'd argue that just because we elect our national leaders now, instead of letting them rule from birth by divine right, we haven't actually eliminated the threat that kings pose. There's a great video by Renegade Cut, which I'll link in the description, called No More Presidents, which makes the compelling case that the modern president of the United States has far, far more power than any 18th century king, much less a 12th century king. As he says in the video, presidents hold so much power and authority that choosing one isn't an expression of our collective power so much as a surrendering of it.
The people have been conditioned to imagine the general election as an exercise in democracy that faithfully elects their representative, instead of seeing it for how it functions in practice, choosing who will rule over them.
And yet the vast majority of Americans are hardly anti-president. Far from it. Electing a president is considered so important in American culture that it's the only political position elected nationally, and is often the only election in which most Americans reliably partake. Ultimately, I think most Americans tend to think of presidents the same way that most Robin Hoods think of kings. They're not a problem, just so long as your preferred ass occupies the seat of power. Whereas I disagree. And so does my preferred Robin of Locksley. I don't think the leaders of the nation should have more power than their constituents. We're both in favor of a radical form of democracy, a government that empowers the people rather than constrains them.
Empower every man, and you will gain strength.
I know some people might say that Rob isn't arguing against the monarchy here so much as he is arguing in favor of some form of benevolent monarchy.
And that king would be great. Not only would he receive the loyalty of his people, but their love as well.
But I really think this is just a case of Robin knowing his audience. He knows he ain't gonna get anywhere by arguing to the king's face that his position shouldn't exist, that his absolute rule should be contested and stripped away, but appealing to his vanity might help. Now that I think about it, this Robin Hood's politics make him much more than just a mere anti-monarchist. He's an anti-capitalist. Dare I say, a communist? Capitalism got its start in England, at about the same time that Robin Hood takes place, in the 12th-ish century, with something called the Enclosure Movement, which is described by Hadass Thier in her book A People's Guide to Capitalism like this. Millions of acres of common land were violently confiscated and turned into privately owned plots during several centuries. Traditional rights to use common land for farming or grazing livestock were revoked. Land was fenced in and restricted to private owners, whether through payment, theft, or law. Through this process, land was concentrated into the hands of few few landowners, while masses of people were left with no means of self-sustenance, and therefore no means to maintain economic independence. And this is exactly what Robin rebels against in the film, the king's ability to turn formerly public resources into private wealth.
Every deer in the land belongs to His Majesty.
These things are God's gifts first before the king's possessions.
Something we do well to remember, homelessness doesn't exist in nature. It had to be invented. It's not a fact of life so much as an artificially constructed incentive to put people to work, usually in conditions that are not at all favorable to the workers. It's actually really easy to get people to act against their own self-interest when there's an even worse option looming ever present before them. As Thier explains, the enclosures in England put an end to collective use of land and instead turned both laborers and the natural world into mere inputs for agricultural and industrial production. Capitalism is usually pitched as a way to encourage rapid innovation. That's its value, so we're told. How else could we develop all the tech we know and love without the rigors of capitalism marshaling the forces of labor? Hey, wait, we can't use footage of NASA. They're publicly funded. Yeah, no, capitalism does encourage rapid innovation, but not for the benefit of everyone, just for those with capital. Throughout history, the thing that tends to get developed the fastest is simply new forms of coercive violence, and usually just weapons of war. In feudal society, peasants generally had access to enough lands and tools to sustain themselves and their families. Because serfs felt no economic compulsion to work, the need for a wage in order to survive, it was ultimately the lord's capacity to mobilize force that prevented peasants from keeping the total fruits of their labor, or from fleeing bondage altogether. Because the enrichment of the lord was dependent on violence, this incentivized each lord to make ever greater investments in weapons and warfare, rather than develop new, innovative, productive techniques, much less tend to the social welfare of his serfs. That's a pretty dense paragraph, but what it basically means is that from the very start, capitalism has always been dependent on coercion and theft. Someone who doesn't do the actual work, commanding the forces that compel the people to obey, taking as much labor and product and profit as possible from the people who do the actual work, up until the point where the people are willing to return violence in kind in order to make it stop. The more things change, the more things stay the same. Under capitalism, anyway.
Now we see the violence inherent in the system.
But so, okay, Robin Hood can be read as anti-capitalist. But what about this commie business? Robin Hood is usually interpreted as a libertarian character, isn't he? And that's a far cry from communist. Some would say it's the opposite. So libertarianism has a dense and somewhat contradictory history that makes it a little difficult to summarize. The two-word summary of their belief system is small government. But some of them don't actually want a small government. They want a very big government that seeks to enforce the powers of pre-existing capital. So some of them advocate for a truly isolationist foreign policy which seeks to avoid any involvement in foreign conflicts, while others treat wars like especially aggressive free markets and want to get in on the ground floor. Some of them think that driving tests constitute an egregious overreach of government authority.
Should someone have to have a government-issued license to drive a car?
Hell no.
But that banning trans people from all public spaces is not. What they believe doesn't easily map on the traditional left and right political spectrum because there's just too much internal disagreement about what constitutes government overreach. In practice, though, libertarians are people, usually middle-class white men, who feel they aren't afforded enough rights and privileges under the current political system. And what rights do middle-class white men not enjoy in today's society? Can you guess? Come on. It's no fun if you don't guess. They want to lower the age of consent and stop paying taxes. So it's no wonder Robin Hood is often read as a libertarian folk hero. Opposition to taxes is usually framed as his big motivating grievance.
Double the taxes, triple the taxes.
But that's not his main beef in this adaptation. Taxes are definitely an important component of the conflict, but the real sticking point is King John's refusal to sign the Magna Carta, or at least an early draft of it. He reneges on his promise to grant all Englishmen a charter of common rights. And that's what ultimately drives Rob into the life of an outlaw. And if we listen to what he actually says when he gets the chance to air his grievances against the crown,
speak if you must.
He doesn't sound anti-tax so much as he is anti-tax with nothing to show for it.
The laws of this land enslave people to its king. A king who demands loyalty but offers nothing in return.
Is that the mark of a communist? Allow me to skip several hours of debate. In our quest to define communism, let's ignore for a moment how you might define it, or even how I might define it, and just skip straight to how the US State Department defines it. In a 1949 State Department intelligence report, Director of Policy Planning George F. Kennan wrote that communists were people who are committed to the belief that the government has direct responsibility for the welfare of the people. I don't know about you, but when I first read that in the book Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti, I had to sit down and stare at a tree for a while. Whatever you think communism is or what communists believe, that is what the US State Department finds so threatening about them. Not the dictatorships that may have sprung up in communism's name. America's got no problem with dictators in principle, having installed so very many herself in just the last century. It's got a problem with people who believe that the government is responsible for the welfare of the people. And I'm not the only one who can map communist ideals onto Robin Hood. In 1954, the so-called Green Feather movement began on the Indiana University campus, in opposition to an Indiana Textbook Commission member's call to ban Robin Hood from all teaching materials within the state. There is a communist directive in education now to stress the story of Robin Hood. They want to stress it because he robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. That's the communist line. It's just smearing law and order, and anything that disrupts law and order is their meat. And look, it's not like I'm doing anything particularly special by mapping a certain set of political beliefs onto Robin Hood. Anyone can. Even stock trading apps can appropriate Robin Hood's image to their heart's content, because ultimately, it's just a story about living well, and there are all kinds of political prescriptions for that, some a lot more terrifying than others. Hadass Thier wasn't talking about Robin Hood when she wrote her book, but she was talking about this time period when she summed up, when capitalism emerged, it developed a wholly new social order, one that required severing the masses of people from access to land, tools, and resources. So all I'm really saying is that if that's the sort of historical, political, and economic analysis that resonates with you, then there isn't any adaptation of Robin Hood that makes it any clearer than this.
I cannot speak for this king.
He is the only king we have.
But not the only hope.
As if this adaptation of Rob H. didn't already have enough to offer. Crackerjack action sequences, a compelling historical narrative, politics that make your grandfather start ranting about dirty commies.
No tax, no tithe, nobody rich, nobody poor. Fair shares for all at nature's table.
Russell Crowe and Cate Blanchett are probably my all-time favorite Robin and Marian.
Is he handsome?
Yes. In the way that yeomen sometimes are, when they're sober.
In terms of pure performance, it'd be reductive to say that Cate Blanchett is just perfect in absolutely everything she does, but I really think she's an inspired choice here. She's defiant but vulnerable, sarcastic but warm, guarded but bold. Her performance embodies a lot of interesting dualities, and it threads a lot of needles.
Oh, is it my turn now?
And as for Russell Crowe, he looks like my dad. They also just so happen to be the two oldest actors to ever play these roles, not including Audrey Hepburn and Sean Connery, but then their movie was about the characters' later lives anyway. In fact, Sean Connery and Russell Crowe were the exact same age when either film came out, and yet the contrast in their abilities is stark.
This is murder.
But enough about acting talent. How cute are they together? I don't want to compare them to any other Robin Hood adaptations anymore, because I think they're good not just as an adaptation of Robin Hood, or even a historical romance, but as a cinematic love story of any kind. It's been said that the Middle Ages was when our modern notion of romantic love was invented.
Now, Father, you're living in the past. This is the 14th century.
Nowadays, I'm still the king, and I command you to come to your senses.
And marry the girl I love.
Exactly.
And it's not like this film is so concerned with historical accuracy that you could say that this is exactly how it went down. But it could have. Robin and Marian have no knowledge of each other when the film begins. They only meet when Rob first rides to the Locksley estate to deliver the news that Locksley is dead, and mistakes poor Marian for a servant.
I'm here to bring the sword.
The son's dead.
Man, what's the opposite of a meet cute?
This way.
Of course, the bedrock of any cinematic love story is tension, and this one has it in spades. Marion doesn't want Robin to pretend to be her husband, even if he's not being an evil, lecherous hump about it. In fact, he's more humbled and embarrassed by their first interaction than she is, which is a nice change from tradition. Most of these swashbuckling adjacent historical adventures make a point of their protagonists enjoying a woman's discomfort.
Easy on the goods, darling.
There is one line where he sorta holds the arrangement over her head for like a second.
Ask me nicely.
But this really feels like it came from another draft. We don't see this smarmy, cocksure version of Robin at any other point in the film. He goes right back to being courteous and deferential to Marion in every other scene. It's a really low bar to clear, but Rob quickly goes on to distinguish himself. Before he arrives in Nottingham, the egotistical toady of a sheriff, played brilliantly against type by Matthew McFadden, is threatening to foreclose on Marion's land and all but force her to marry him.
Sir Walter is dying without an heir. Pepper Harrow will fall to the crown, and you will be living in the hedgerow.
Then when Rob happens to find himself by way of sheer luck into that exact arrangement, where he's got control of Marion's land and her hand in marriage, at least as far as the law is concerned, he doesn't use that arrangement to take advantage of her. Again, not a super high bar to clear, but there are ways to clear even the lowest of bars in style.
To see Lady Marion Locksley's legs, beyond my wildest hopes this morning.
I don't believe you know my husband.
It's no coincidence that his very first interaction with the sheriff also happens to be their last.
Here's an arm's worth of tax for the exchequer. Your insolence to Lady Marion. I'll consider a debt between us.
Turn down for what? Turn down for what?
Once Rob has made it clear to Marion that he's not just some lecherous opportunist, their subsequent courtship is free to develop naturally. It doesn't feel rushed or forced or manufactured. It feels like the romance develops in spite of all the genre conventions, rather than because of them. They respect each other's boundaries, they share just as many challenges as they do laughs, and really come to enjoy each other's company before anyone decides what to call it. I just love these two crazy kids. So by the time Rob finally says the thing,
I love you, Marion,
it really feels like the movie earned it. I usually take a good long while to choose what my next video is going to be. Weeks, sometimes months. But as soon as I thought, I think it actually happened on a live stream. As soon as I thought, you know, Robin Hood would make a great idea for an episode of Schlock and All, I just instantly knew that was going to be my next video. I hadn't seen it for a few years at that point, but then I watched it 3 times in preparation for this video. Once to refamiliarize myself, twice to take notes, and thrice because I was still in the mood to watch it. It makes me feel good. Hope? Anybody remember what hope feels like? As I record this video, retirement looks a little dicey. Social Security set to run out before I'm even 50, my savings hit 0 every time there's an unexpected medical emergency, my pension is a mere pittance, and as for cashing in the equity of my home, even though I've spent $180,000 on housing costs over the last 11 years, none of it contributed to my equity. I wasn't paying my mortgage, I was paying my landlord's, which they could then claim on their taxes. So even though I'm at least 30 years away from retirement, I have no clue how I'm gonna pay for it. I don't think that cutting out lattes is gonna cut it. We need large-scale action and intervention. There needs to be a fundamental restructuring of what taxes, land, community, war, national borders, and government is even for. It wouldn't look like this, but maybe it would feel like this. Do you remember how I end every episode of Schlock and Awe? It's been a while. Pre-COVID, in fact. Do you remember? I don't like giving out numbered scores with delusions of objectivity. I prefer giving out subjective, cumulative, qualitative awards that reflect some idea or feeling contained within the film that might then indicate how you'll feel about it. If for nothing else, at least you know what to drink. Robin Hood gets the 100% Pure Mead Award. I know it might sound like a no-brainer, awarding mead to a film that literally just features mead.
Have you tried the honey liquor we call mead?
But it was weirdly difficult to track down a brand that didn't add a bunch of fruit or hops to the mix. Mead is not honey-flavored wine. It's fermented honey and water, and maybe a few spices. No fruit involved. Anyway, just as a beverage, it's the perfect fit. It's festive, it's earthy, a little cold and a little warm. It starts off dry and then it hits you with just the right amount of sweetness. It doesn't have the most flash, but then not everyone's looking for flash. Some people just want something that's gonna make them smile.
I'm gonna make her smile. I'm gonna make you smile! Come over here!
I rose up in the morning and I felt a dire need to dream away the dreary day and down a cup of mead. I felt the sting of honeybees from last night's revelry. I'm looking for the honey that'll cure my soul's disease.
I'm not here to question anyone's taste. My teeth are very smooth.